So in this lecture, we look at resistance and opposition in the Nazi German state. One of the things that you have to really be careful of is sometimes the questions ask you until 1939 or something, or until the beginning of the war. So please make sure that you look at the resistance and opposition, and you cut off at that date, at that 39, or else you won't understand the question, and you will lose marks. So learning outcomes is to understand the nature and the nature and form that opposition took within the Nazi regime, and to analyze the reasons for limited opposition. So one of the things we can definitely say about the Nazi regime is that there was opposition, but it was not consistent, and it was not organized. We have individual, isolated cases of group individual resistance that essentially happened during times of uncertainty. On 1939, on the eve of war, when people were kind of opposed to going to war. And then in 42 and 45, once the tide of the war had turned and things weren't looking so hot for Germany. Overall, we have lots of complaint about lack of wage increases before this time, more work hours, and mandatory activities of strength through joy, and lack of consumer goods, which we'll discuss some of this when we talk about the economic policies. But while people grumbled, they didn't try to do anything about the regime. People were upset about the economic conditions and their lifestyle, but not necessarily about the Nazi regime and how the government was organized. So overall, resistance and opposition during the Nazi regime was quite quiet. Something to consider, as we look at its regime, is the extent of totalitarianness. And so one of the things we can definitely say is that it was somewhat incomplete because there was some opposition, and the Gestapo knew about this opposition. And here we're talking about we're talking about opposition to the government, not necessarily the resistance as people subverted the anti-Semitic policies. And so we have opposition ranging from general talk and grumbles and complaints to active resistance. And resistance came from three main areas, that is, from the left, from the right, and from the youth. So here I will discuss the churches a little, because in your presentations, somebody is going to discuss in greater depth Nazi domestic policy toward the church. So here we're just looking at it in terms of opposition. And so one of the things, of course, is there was never any large official like whole church condemnation of the Nazi regime. There were official formal complaints about specific issues instead. There were Catholic protests against replacing crucifix with Hitler portraits in Catholic schools. There was Protestant objection in the form of the confessional church. And this was less a condemnation of the regime and more about separation of church and state, because they saw the church being invaded by the state once Hitler set up the state church. And so they started the confessional church in opposition to that. There was Catholic opposition to the euthanasia program, which the euthanasia program you will discuss in greater detail when you look at the treatment of minorities and vulnerable peoples in the population. Overall, Christianity was not effective as general opposition. So one of the things that we spoke about previously in the support thing is because the church, neither of the churches, the Protestant or Catholic churches, said anything official against the Nazi regime, many people felt that there wasn't a conflict in joining the party and with the regime in general. Now, we've spoken about, for example, the Catholic Church in Italy and the Catholic Church in Spain, and kind of you should think about this and contrast the role that they played in taking down the regime in terms of Spain, and Mussolini needing to reach accommodations with the church in order for him to consolidate his rule. But it was more of a national conscience, such as looking at the euthanasia program. Many clergy, again, this was more of an individual basis. Many clergy did speak out against the Nazi program, against the treatment of various groups within society, and many of those went into concentration camps. Now, the regime had to be careful, had to toe the line a little, because many people were very faithful. And so if they acted out too far against the church, then they didn't want to trigger a sort of social uprising against them. But they did take active roles. The regime did take an active stance in trying to undermine Christianity, such as with the Nazi faith movement and the state church. Most remained faithful, and church attendance actually increased after 1939, especially after the war began. So again, the person who is discussing the relationship of, or the group that's discussing the relationship of the regime with religion, should be going into this into much greater depth. And one of the things that I will add for you is an article that discusses the whole idea of Pius XII being the Nazi Pope, and kind of a change in that perception. As stated previously, one of the groups that did provide opposition to the Nazi regime was the left. So we have opposition from through political activism from the communists and social democrats. So these are the guys who were heavily targeted by the Nazis from the very beginning. And one of the things is that they previously had support of the working class. So there was this idea to try to get people to work against them. The communists did try. However, the Gestapo was very efficient at identifying and eradicating cells. And from the law banning political parties, so from 1933, we have 1,000 Social Democratic Party members and 150,000 members of the Communist Party were already in concentration camps. And so by 1935, there was very little left of the Communist Party within the country. People had basically been driven underground and trying to stay alive. The other thing that happened, of course, is when Hitler signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact in 1939, some of that persecution against the left, against the communists, eased up. However, now, of course, they're getting direction from Moscow that they need to be working with the Nazis overall. So they kind of had very little to do. And then the Social Democratic leaders were all in exile. So there was very little leadership to kind of drive rebellion and recruit and organize people. Keep in mind and remember that the trade unions had been banned, and the National Labor Union had been created. And so that essentially meant that there were no formal organizations to be able to go out amongst people and drum up support. So overall, there was these two groups had very little success in getting working classes to risk their livelihoods and families. Remember, people are coming out of the Great Depression and the massive amounts of unemployment. And essentially, in order to keep jobs, in order to be able to feed their families and such, they had to toe the line. So people weren't willing to give up that safety in order to oppose the regime. The greatest opposition that to the Nazi regime came from the right, which one would think would be more aligned to the whole Nazi purpose. And so from the right, we have wholesale attempts to remove the regime, which is a different tactic than what the left was attempting. And so we have the Schwarzkapelle, which is the Black Orchestra. And this was a loose group of individuals who often came from the aristocracy. And they essentially didn't like Hitler because, well, he offended their aristocratic ideals. And they were united by the fact that they didn't like Hitler. And they thought that he was going to be taking Germany to ruin, especially after war preparations began. These guys were very conservative, and in a way kind of hoisted by their own petard, right? And they were enemies of the former republic. So the same people who didn't like the republic and worked to bring it down would then unite to attempt to bring Hitler down. And one of these guys was General Beck. And General Beck, in 1939, he resigned. In 1938, he tried to persuade the general staff, that is, the leaders of the military, to remove Hitler. And General Beck had originally supported Hitler, and he thought that Hitler, away from the negative influence of the SA, would provide that, would, one, be more moderate, and be able to provide that unifying element that the Republic needed. And so he supported totalitarianism, but when Hitler starts advancing into very aggressive foreign policies, he feels that that Hitler was positioning Germany quite poorly within the rest of Europe, and it would then therefore ruin Germany. Ultimately, these guys, the numbers were too low to be effective. And von Moltke was a lawyer and a landed aristocrat, and he very much opposed Hitler. And part of it was religious grounds, and he didn't try like an armed revolt or anything. When war broke out, he was drafted into the counterintelligence service. And so what he tried to do was use his influence or his information to give information to the Allied powers. He tried to convince the Nazi government to abide by the Geneva Convention, and tried to mitigate some of the policies implemented by the Nazi regime in local areas. So basically, he was trying to modify, I guess, again, the word is mitigate, the abuses of the Nazi regime. And he was basically trying to get the Nazi regime to be more moral and to observe human rights. And he has the Kreisau circle because that is the estate that he and his friends would meet. And so because they were trying to change the way the Nazi regime operated, and especially after some of the defeats of World War II, he and his friends were arrested and killed for treason in 1945. One of the things that happens is that a lot of the people who resisted Hitler were, again, conservative and rightist, and a lot of them were actually former members of Hitler's inner circle. And so we have, for example, the bomb attack of July 20, 1944, in which a bomb was set off during the strategy meetings in East Prussia, and hoping to kill Hitler. After the declaration of war in 1939, there were 15 attempted assassination attacks on Hitler. And a lot of them came from the inner circle. We have, for example, involved in the July 20th plot, the former ambassador appointed by Hitler to Italy. And until that time, he also used his position to feed information to the Allied powers, and also to try to negotiate a sort of ceasefire behind Hitler's back. We have Stauffenberg, who carried the bomb in, and he was part of Hitler's. He was a colonel in the military who was a regular member of these meetings. And then you of course have Rommel, the Desert Fox, and this guy was one of the most respected generals within Germany. Who he fought and led the Desert Campaign during World War II, and he had also a sort of like a lot of popular support, and he was also implicated in this plot. Essentially, the people who turned against Hitler at this time were either in the military for a couple of reasons. One, these military minds had an idea of the disastrous nature of Hitler's world war, right? And Hitler's commanding of the armed forces and the mistakes he was making, and essentially that he was going to be leading the country into chaos and into losing and into another situation like at the end of World War I, where they lose everything and they're severely punished. The other thing, of course, is these guys often had had a lot of access to Hitler, right? They were constantly around him, and therefore had increased ability to attempt to assassinate him. However, all of these failed to remove the regime from within. There were too few people, it wasn't organized enough, so on and so forth. And they all wound up dying. Show trials and concentration camps and death. Here we have the room they were in after the bomb blast in the July 20 plot. That he made it through, Hitler pretty much thought that surviving basically gave him divine support to continue what he was doing. Basically, that he was in the right there, and the universe helped him survive to implement his ideas. So another big group of opposition came from the youth. Now, these rarely amounted to very much, but it does show that not everybody was in agreement with the policies of the Nazi regime. One was the White Rose Group. Now, this began in 1942 by 5 university students and a professor at Munich University. You often have resistance from youth because, well, essentially they have nothing to lose. And so these guys were protesting the brutality of the Nazi regime in occupied Europe. So, and we'll talk more about occupied Europe when we look at World War II. So we're talking about in places like Poland and other places in Eastern Europe and stuff like that. And so it started with a pair of siblings, brothers and sisters, and they distributed leaflets trying to let people know what atrocities were being committed outside of Germany in the name of Germany. And so they did this for a year. But after the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943, they distributed leaflets about basically the incompetence of Hitler and his irresponsibility rather in the fruitlessness of the hundreds of thousands of lives lost essentially over this battle of Stalingrad. And they were a worker at the school saw them, and they were arrested and guillotined. And at this point in time, there was support for the person who turned against them, and so it kind of shows that, like, even though they were educating people and stuff like this, it was a very small group of people, and they had difficulty trying to topple this massive regime. We also have social deviance being used as a form of resistance. And so you have, for example, the swing youth. And these guys basically didn't accept the Nazi definition of what youth should be like. And so their protest was really in adopting American culture, and especially American jazz and the dance from that time. And this was in direct opposition to, as you guys who are doing the presentation on youth will expand on this. So this was direct opposition to the sort of straight-laced Aryan ideal of that the Nazi regime put forth, and also a direct rebellion against this traditional vote culture that was also a really big part of the Nazi appeal and ideal. And the other thing is that jazz is developed within the black community in the US. So this is also kind of direct opposition to the eugenics ideas by adopting this black American culture and way of being, and kind of skipping out on the Hitler Youth thing. They were rebelling. And we also have the Edelweiss Pirates. And we specifically talk about the Edelweiss Pirates, but there were a number of smaller groups operating as well. And essentially, these operated, again, in direct opposition to the Hitler Youth. And instead of participating in the Hitler Youth, they did this. And for example, the Edelweiss Pirates had strong Catholic connections. And essentially, what they were trying to do is protest the amoral doctrines of Nazism by promoting like core good moral German values. The Gestapo said that basically they had infiltrated the Hitler Youth, and they cracked down on them hard. And so in 1944, 12 young people, and we're talking about like under the age of like 16, were publicly hung in order to kind of oppress and suppress these movements. And of course, you have to think about what the state of the war is like in 1944 and why the reaction is going to be so heavy. Ultimately, none of these amounted to any real political opposition. These were small groups of young people opposing through, I don't know, having long hair and beating up people in the Hitler Youth. That's what the Edelweiss Pirates did. And this was just not organized, so it didn't gain too much traction. Here we have a Nazi propaganda against jazz music, and you can see that they are equating African Americans with Jews as a way to try to get parents to and children to turn away from this whole jazz movement thing, and of course the caricature of the black character. And so in clamping down against this, some of the students were forced to go to concentration camps as well, or forced back to school, etc., etc. The execution, the hanging of the Edelweiss Pirates in 44. So now we get to the red letter part. Yay! So why do you think opposition generally wasn't morally based? Consider the discussion about support that we had previously, and try to make this as well-rounded as possible, as well as the steps taken in consolidating and maintaining power. Which brings us to the surprise. Okay. Why wouldn't the shrimp share his treasure? Because he's a little shellfish. You loved it. You know you loved it.